Okay, so obviously right now a lot of people aren't able to go to school, and so I thought maybe I could try. So while this may not be something you're used to, I understand this isn't something that's done in every school. I find it helpful to have learning objectives as a kind of checklist. If you feel you can check all of this off at the end of this video, then you know everything you need to know on the subject. Today we're going to be looking at the Treaty of Versailles. By the end of this video, you should know what the Treaty of Versailles was and its terms and who was involved in the making of it. And finally, what people's opinions were of the Treaty of Versailles. So firstly, we'll be looking at what the Treaty of Versailles was. The treaty itself was signed in 1918, and it contained the promise of peace between the Allies and their enemies from World War One. One of the enemies that we're going to be focusing on was Germany, and this was what the Treaty of Versailles basically focused on, as you'll find out later. The treaty ended up being signed by the politicians who were maintaining Germany after the Kaiser had run away from Germany in order to escape any punishment he may face for the war. Obviously, that was just a brief summary of what the Treaty of Versailles was, but we're going to dive right into looking at who was involved in the making of the Treaty of Versailles. There were three main ones, and these were the Allies. There was France, and they sent the representative George Clemenceau, and then Britain, who sent Lloyd George, and the United States, who sent Woodrow Wilson. I've purposely done a traffic colour system to show you where each leader stood with regards to what should be in the treaty. The red used for France shows that they had the most extreme policies towards the treaty and wanting to stop Germany from ever returning to what they were. France wanted to see Germany extremely punished to the point of being beyond recovery. This is so they could prevent another war and get rid of the threat that Germany presented to France as their neighbour. It is unsurprising that France took this stance, as they had suffered from the most during the war. Britain and America had quite different experiences, as they were separated from Germany by sea. Britain obviously still suffered losses, but they were less eager to see Germany destroyed. Rather, they wanted to see Germany punished, but Lloyd George's aim was to punish them, but not to the point where Germany couldn't recover, as they wanted to be able to have a viable trade partner in Germany. United States was on kind of a complete opposite side to France, hence the green. they didn't really face as much losses as France and Britain, and simply wanted reparations from Germany, or not so much reparations to ruin the German economy. Woodrow Wilson came up with 14 points to see this happen. Now, one of the first points I want to talk about is the restriction of arms nationally. This obviously is quite fair if you think about it. It wasn't something that was being targeted specifically at Germany, and it also made sure to kind of add in that should only be done to the point where it wasn't risking the defence of a nation. So that's quite different to what obviously France and Britain were asking for. There was also the fact that colonial adjustments would be made impartially. So even though Germany had made a good deal of advances during the war, they would kind of not take out more than what there had been beforehand. This is important as it meant that German-speaking people wouldn't have ended up trapped in a different nation. There was also the evacuation of all Russian and Belgian territory. This is quite basic. It's an understandable demand. Obviously, if the war's finished, you shouldn't still be having enemy troops in different lands. It's not really something that's going to be acceptable to any land because of things such as spies. Okay, another thing that the 14 points asked for was the liberation of France and the return of Alsace and Lorraine to France. Basically, I feel like this was kind of an attempt to revert to pre-war France in a way. It's kind of understandable why this would be something that France wouldn't really accept, as even though they'd be getting the return of Alsace and Lorraine, the rest of the country's in a state, and you know, it's not really going to be able to help them as much as the reparations they did eventually ask for would have. Finally, there was an independent Poland to be just established with free and secure access to the sea. If you look at maps after the First World War, you can see that there's kind of a corridor on the map of land, and this was called the Polish Corridor, and this was basically given to Poland to ensure that they had access to the sea. This meant then that, you know, if another world war was to happen, Poland would be able to have access to its allies, which was Britain at the time, which was something that they struggled with during World War One. Because obviously of the cut off of the sea. You know, if you look on the map, Poland's not connected to Britain by the sea. It's not connected to America by the sea either, and it's kind of understandable why they'd want this as well, because not only was Poland surrounded by Germany, on the other side of Poland there was also Russia, and there's obviously a great mistrust for Russia, so it kind of makes sense. The final one, and arguably the most important point that I want to speak about, is that there was a proposal for a general association between the nations. Basically, this is what became known as the League of Nations. You know, all these countries coming together to try to prevent another world war. This was supposed to be the guarantee that France was asking for, that they would be safe from Germany or even any other country that shares Europe with them from another war. Okay, so those 14 points to me seem quite reasonable, but very few of them were actually taken up. In fact, I'd say the only few that kind of were taken at their intention was the League of Nations point. Obviously, stuff like France being given back Alsace and Lorraine was also done, but they also demilitarised a zone between Germany and France, so it was kind of took more extreme than the points had asked for. Another thing that kind of seems to stem from the 14 points was about the the restriction of arms nationally. In the Treaty of Versailles, it talked about how they limited the German army and navy. They forbade it from maintaining an air force, and they also basically heavily reduced any kind of German defence and didn't really ask any other countries to do this. You know, and this wasn't really asking either. This was like a requirement. If they would have gone against this, it would have meant that the Treaty of Versailles would have been void, and Germany would have been heavily penalised. I want to move on to something as well. That there was also demilitarisation or occupation of the Rhineland. This has greater significance later on, in that it was kind of the first part of the Treaty of Versailles that Hitler breaks, and that the League of Nations lets Hitler get away with. Finally, I want to talk about how the Treaty of Versailles gave Germany new boundaries. It basically moved Germany completely. If you look at a map of Germany before World War One and a map of Germany after World War One, you can see that it's kind of shifted. You know, this is something as well that the 14 points did ask for, but it definitely was not done impartially. It seems to be that places took the parts that they needed, in a way. You know, you ended up with a big amount of German speakers in other countries, just because those places with the German speakers were considered quite beneficial financially, or they'd been considered that countries years and years and years before the war, but the countries considered it their right to get their places back. I'd say maybe the second most important part of the treaty that we're going to look at is the requirement to pay reparations. They were required to pay 132 billion gold marks, and France was allowed to take coal from the Saarland in reparation from Germany. This is such a big deal because Germany's in the same state that France is in. It's in the same state that Britain is in. It's war torn. It's, you know, it's for the past few years it's been relying on its war economy in a way. You know, agriculture has been stressed to the limit in able to make sure that they're somewhat self-efficient during the war. So they're not in a really good place to begin with, and then this requirement to pay that amount of reparations is basically impossible, especially in the state they're in after the war. But not only are they kind of required to pay it, you know, they've got ways of kind of being forced to pay it. You know, they can't just say no, you know, we can't afford to pay it, we haven't got the money, because that means that France has got the right to kind of take over in a way and force them to. Obviously, you know, this wasn't something that was good for morale in the country, especially after a lot of the people in Germany have lost a war that they thought they'd win. And I mean, a lot of these people were just following a leader, which you know, is what the majority of British and French people were doing at the time. Finally, perhaps I think anyway, the most important part of the treaty, and I feel the catalyst for the events leading up to World War Two, was Article 231. It's better known as the War Guilt Clause, which it basically means what it says. It forced Germany to accept full responsibility for starting World War One. This was basically where the treaty takes its right, basically, to be able to demand reparations. You know, and it also kind of is very, 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 at least in the eyes of the German citizens at the time, unfair. You know, they're not the only country that was involved in the war. You know, there was also other places, and yet Germany was the one that was being punished for it, whereas the other places that have been involved in the war don't seem to be receiving that same punishment. Okay. Okay, so as you can gather from the last slide, the Germans weren't very happy with the treaty at all. The Treaty of Versailles meant that Germany was plunged into poverty, and with the amount of reparations that were due to be paid, they had no hope of being able to overcome this poverty in the near future. You know, it's a big deal if you're being forced to pay money that you just don't have. It led to money decreasing in value, and it made establishing a new government, a democratic government, even harder, because people could not support people, because when people were put into government they could not deal with this poverty. They had no way of dealing with it, and actually they became so enraged at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that the politicians that had been kind of they called them the November criminals. You know, this has very heavy connotations. You can kind of tell just from the name of it that they're not very happy about it. You know, criminals, in a way, it's definitely not a good word to have directed at you. And if it's something that's been directed at you by the whole country, you know, in a way, kind of does make you a criminal, especially in a democratic country where democracy decides what is a criminal offence. Okay, moving on, I want to talk about Britain, France, and America. They all kind of had their own opinions on the treaty. Not surprising, as they had such different kind of demands going into it. It was obvious that not everybody was going to be completely 100% satisfied. But starting with France, France was not happy with the terms. They wanted to be harsher and felt Germany deserved more punishment. You know, I mean, obviously, I personally think that Germany was quite heavily punished. You can make that decision yourselves based on the terms you saw. Obviously, there was a reason they were punished this way. You know, France had faced a lot of death and a lot of economic challenges because of the war. That, you know, it's understandable they felt the way they did. They didn't really have any long-term assurance that Germany wouldn't be able to attack them again. You know, this demilitarised border, you know, it's only something that's temporary. You know, there's nothing stopping them from kind of going into the demilitarised zone, except for the League of Nations, which again depends on the cooperation of all the countries involved. Let's see. Britain didn't really have much time to worry about the treaty. Directly after World War One, Britain was facing horrible poverty caused by the war. You know, there was a lot of death just from poverty itself. In a way, the war wasn't really over for Britain. They were still basically at war, only now they were at war with their social conditions in a way. Terrible housing conditions, terrible hospitals, terrible economic conditions, that kind of thing. Finally, I mean, if you look at the 14 points and you compare them to the Treaty of Versailles, you can kind of tell, you know, where it's been taken to heart, kind of, in a way. You know, they didn't really take a lot of the 14 points from Woodrow Wilson and incorporate them into the Treaty of Versailles as they were. But I think that America had received the reassurance they needed that a world war would not happen again like that, with the creation of the League of Nations. So that was at least something that Woodrow Wilson could take back to America to reassure people that such a thing would not happen again. Okay, so I'm going to end it here today. I hope this has been helpful to you in some way. Go back and look at the learning objectives, see what you can tick off. If you feel that it hasn't got in, it's here for you to kind of come back to. And I will be trying to get more videos up in the weeks that follow while, we're all on lockdown in the UK. I genuinely hope this helps you guys, because I know how difficult it was in high school, and I can't imagine how much more difficult it must be trying to do this on yourself. Okay, on yourself.